we need to talk about something that's incredibly difficult. We're going to look into the psychology behind one of history's darkest chapters to try and understand a really unsettling question. How do ordinary people, people who even take an oath to heal, end up committing acts of extraordinary evil? Just listen to that for a second. That's a confession from a man who, after he graduated from medical school, said his dream was to just be a simple village doctor. But instead, he became a key player in a research program that really shows the absolute depths of what humanity is capable of. So during World War II, Japan's infamous Unit 731 was responsible for some truly unspeakable experiments. I mean, we're talking about vivisections on patients who were wide awake, infecting whole communities with the plague, and even intentionally freezing people's limbs just to see what would happen. And that brings us to the central mystery here. We know what happened. The historical record is pretty clear, but if we have any hope of making sure this kind of thing never happens again, we have to dig into the deeply uncomfortable why. Okay, so the most common explanation, the one our brains kind of naturally jump to when we're faced with this kind of horror, is this idea called dehumanization. And you know what? On the surface, it makes a lot of sense. So here's the psychological puzzle at the heart of it. Imagine you're a doctor. Your entire identity is built around the idea that I am a healer. But your actions, every single day, are I am torturing people. That conflict, that mental friction, psychologists call it cognitive dissonance. And it creates this intense, unbearable pressure in your mind that just has to be resolved. So how do you solve that problem? Well, the perpetrators didn't change their monstrous behavior. No. Instead, they just changed their belief. They started telling themselves, oh, these victims aren't really human. And just like that, the terrible mental conflict, it just goes away. And this is where it gets really chilling. The entire facility was actually disguised to the outside world as a lumber mill. And that disguise crept into the language. Prisoners weren't people anymore. They were maruta. They were logs. You can just imagine them saying that to each other, right? How many logs did you down today? It became normal. It's a simple, terrifying explanation. So case closed? Well, not exactly. The evidence tells a much more complicated and, frankly, a much more disturbing story. Because here's the twist, and it is a disturbing one. The evidence strongly suggests that for a lot of these experiments, the perpetrators weren't ignoring their victims' humanity at all. In fact, they were relying on it. Think about it this way. There's zero satisfaction in hurting something that can't feel pain, right? Kicking a rock does nothing for you. So the very act of sadistic torture and the scientific data they wanted to collect, it all depended on the fact that the victims were physiologically human, just like them. And get this. A huge number of the experiments they did had absolutely no military or medical value. It was, as one researcher later admitted, a form of sadistic play. They weren't treating these people like inanimate logs. They were using their shared humanity as a tool to inflict the most suffering possible. This means we have to look deeper. That simple explanation of dehumanization, it just doesn't cut it. We have to look at the personal ambitions and the incredibly intense social pressures that were twisting these doctors' minds. So the first piece of this more complex puzzle is something that's surprisingly familiar to all of us, even if this is a much, much darker version of it. Good old-fashioned self-interest. So these researchers were really driven by two powerful internal forces. First, career ambition. Working at this facility was basically a golden ticket. And second, an extreme, morbid curiosity. They just wanted to see what happens when the human body is pushed way, way past its absolute limits. But hold on, plenty of people are ambitious. A lot of us have a bit of morbid curiosity. I mean, that's why we watch true crime documentaries. But that doesn't turn us into monsters. There had to be another, much more powerful force at work here. And this is where we get to the absolute core of it. This is where we see the immense, almost inescapable power of social psychology. You might have heard of this classic experiment. You put one person in a room full of actors, and you ask them a really simple question, like which of these 3 lines is longest? When all the actors start giving a clearly wrong answer, more than a third of the real subjects will deny what they're seeing with their own 2 eyes just to go along with the group. And Dr. Yuasa himself explains this intense pressure. For him, it wasn't just about fitting in with his buddies. No, it was about protecting his entire family from being shamed, persecuted, and branded as traitors. The stakes were unbelievably high. But the pressure to conform was only half the equation. The other half was obedience. In Stanley Milgram's famous experiment, almost 2/3 of ordinary people were willing to deliver what they thought were fatal electric shocks to a total stranger, just because a guy in a lab coat told them to. And this testimony just brings it all together. When you're in the middle of a hyper-nationalist war, your sense of morality can completely flip upside down. Obeying orders from your superior, especially a guy like Shiro Ishii, the unit's leader who they literally saw as a god, that wasn't just okay. It was seen as the highest form of patriotism. So, what does all of this mean for us today? Because that's really the most important takeaway from this entire dark history. The people who did these things at Unit 731, they weren't some different species of monster born without a soul. They were ordinary human beings put into an extraordinary situation, a perfect storm of powerful and totally universal psychological forces. And that, right there, is the most chilling lesson of all. These forces, ambition, curiosity, our need to conform, our instinct to obey, they didn't just disappear after World War II. They are latent within all of us, in every single society, today. You know, the easy answer is to say that they were evil and we are good. But the truth is so much more unsettling. The psychology suggests their motivations were all too human. So the real question is, what then really separates us from them? It's something worth thinking about long after this is over. We need